The American dreams fracture and the Lost Boys welcome to Ghost Vibes. The face of American evil often wears a smile. In the 1970s, the face of that evil belonged to John Wayne Gacy, a celebrated community member, a local businessman, and a fixture at children's parties where he performed as Pogo the Clown. But beneath the costume, beneath the laughter, Gacy was building a secret legacy of unimaginable horror, one that would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. Our story begins in the suburbs of Cook County, Illinois, a place defined by peace and prosperity. The tranquility began to crack in the early 1970s with the increasing number of missing persons reports, specifically, young men and teenage boys who seemed to vanish without a trace from the streets of Chicago and its surrounding areas. The missing persons were initially treated as runaways by the police, a common dismissive assumption in that era. The victims came from vulnerable backgrounds, young men struggling with drug addiction, those working in casual labor, or those who frequented gay bars in the city. Their families and friends were often dismissed, and the cases remained disconnected and low priority. This systemic failure to link the initial disappearances allowed Gacy to operate unimpeded for years. Gacy's public profile served as his perfect camouflage. He was the epitome of the trusted neighbor, a political campaign worker, a dedicated local contractor known as a reliable foreman, and a charitable entertainer. He cultivated relationships with police and local politicians, ensuring that any minor suspicion cast his way was quickly dismissed due to his upstanding character. He was literally above suspicion. The turning point came in December 1978, with the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest. Piest told his mother he was going to meet a man named Jack Hanley, an alias Gacy used, about a possible job at Gacy's contracting business. Piest never returned home. Crucially, Piest's mother immediately reported the full details to the police, giving them a definitive lead on Gacy. When the police arrived at Gacy's suburban ranch-style home on Summerdale Avenue, they were polite but firm. Gacy, ever the confident performer, welcomed them in. What the officers initially noticed was not a clue, but a strange, cloying odor, a heavy, sweet and sour smell of decay, masked by overpowering commercial air fresheners. The search for Robert Piest was about to lead police not to a runaway, but to the deepest, darkest secret hidden beneath the floorboards of the American dream. The Covert scent and the Anderson investigation. The initial police investigation at John Wayne Gacy's house was hindered by Gacy's masterful deception. Upon entering the home, police noted the intense smell, but Gacy calmly explained it away, claiming he had drainage problems and a recent battle with a rodent infestation under the house, which was why he had poured copious amounts of lime into the crawl space. This explanation, combined with Gacy's friendly demeanor, was enough to initially satisfy the patrol officers. However, Detective Joseph Kozenczak, the lead investigator on Robert Piest's case, had an unnerving feeling about Gacy. Kozenczak knew Gacy's perfect facade was too polished. He ordered a more thorough, discreet surveillance of the house and followed Gacy for days, noting his strange, compulsive behaviors and erratic driving patterns. The breakthrough came from an ordinary maintenance technician working for Gacy. The technician admitted to Kozenczak that Gacy had requested a peculiar job: the installation of special wooden lids over the ventilation ducts in the house's foundation, effectively sealing the crawl space. Gacy claimed this was to prevent further rat entry, but the technician found the request unusual and costly. This detail immediately elevated Kozenczak's suspicion. On December 20, 1978, armed with a search warrant, Kozenczak and a team returned to Gacy's property. They began to focus on the crawl space where the smell was strongest. The crawl space was extremely shallow, difficult to navigate, and filled with a mixture of lime and construction debris. Gacy's contracting tools and materials were scattered everywhere. The search team eventually located the strange makeshift duct covers and removed one. What they found underneath was horrifying. They first saw dirt, then noticed an area of the floor that was disturbingly soft and uneven. As the officers began to dig, they uncovered the first definitive, grisly evidence: human remains. The discovery was not of a single body, but multiple sets of decomposing remains hastily wrapped in plastic sheeting and buried just inches beneath the soil. Gacy, watching the search from a nearby squad car, finally broke. The perfectly controlled image shattered. He confessed, but with a chilling, manipulative twist. He claimed his crimes were the result of a second violent personality, a persona he called Jack. Gacy's House of Horrors was not a simple home. It was a mass grave, a burial ground hidden in plain sight. And the initial find was just the beginning of a massive forensic excavation. The police realized they weren't looking for one missing boy, but for an untold number of victims. The true scale of Gacy's depravity was about to shock the entire nation. The crawl space, the anatomy of a mass grave, the discovery of human remains beneath John Wayne Gacy's suburban home transformed the investigation into a massive, meticulously grim forensic operation. Police officers, forensic pathologists, and archaeologists worked tirelessly under harrowing conditions for weeks. The primary challenge was the environment itself. The crawl space was extremely tight, in some areas barely 2 feet high, and the foul, decaying odors, combined with the extreme cold of the Chicago winter, made the recovery effort grueling. Gacy's confession, while chilling, did not simplify the task. He detailed his methods with a disturbing lack of emotion, describing how he would lure young men with promises of construction work or money, incapacitate them, and then dispose of the bodies beneath his home, often forcing them into crude, shallow graves that were difficult to identify and retrieve. As the digging continued, the true horrifying scale of Gacy's killing spree was revealed. Investigators systematically located and excavated 29 sets of human remains from the crawl space and the yard surrounding the house. Gacy had utilized every available space, burying victims not just under the main floor, but in trenches dug around the foundation. The scene provided a unique and tragic insight into the killer's psychological methodology. The bodies were often found wrapped in the plastic sheeting and tarps Gacy used for his construction business. Gacy's victims became little more than construction refuse, disguised and sealed beneath the foundations of the house he had built and controlled. The lime Gacy had poured was not a rodent deterrent. It was a crude attempt to hasten decomposition and suppress the odor, a strategy that ultimately failed. Pathologists faced an immense challenge in identifying the remains. Due to the shallow nature of the graves and the time the bodies had spent buried, many were severely decomposed. The victims were identified using dental records, bone analysis, and, crucially, clothes and personal effects found with the remains. Of the 33 total victims Gacy eventually confessed to murdering, 29 were recovered from his own property. The remaining 4 victims Gacy claimed to have disposed of by throwing them into the Des Plaines River. This forced the investigation to expand dramatically, initiating a massive, frustrating search of the river system. The sheer volume of murder victims buried beneath a single, unassuming home in a quiet neighborhood shattered the public's sense of security. Gacy had literally turned the American suburban dream house into a tomb, operating a personal killing factory right under the noses of his neighbors, friends, and the very police officers he cultivated relationships with. The monster was not lurking in the shadows. He was the life of the party, hiding his victims in the most permanent way possible, in the structure of his own domestic life. The identity of the victims and the missing 4. The painstaking process of identifying the 29 bodies recovered from the Gacy residence, later known as the largest single-site discovery of victims from an American serial killer, brought a tragic focus to the lives Gacy had erased. The victims were overwhelmingly young, ranging in age from 14 to 27. They represented a demographic that the authorities had historically overlooked, amplifying the initial failure of the investigation. The victims included several of Gacy's own employees from his contracting company, PDM contractors, young men who trusted their boss implicitly. The list also included transient individuals and young men Gacy targeted in areas where vulnerable populations gathered. The identification process was slow, often relying on the heroic efforts of forensic odontologists, dental experts, who matched decades-old dental records to the severely decomposed skulls. The recovery effort provided not just the identities of the dead, but definitive confirmation of Gacy's manipulative control. He utilized his position of power and his reputation as a good guy to lure his victims, often promising them jobs, money, or a temporary place to stay. This element of betrayal of trust became central to the prosecution's case. However, even after the exhaustive excavation of the house, 4 of Gacy's confessed victims remained missing. Gacy claimed he disposed of these bodies, along with the body of his very first victim whom he murdered prior to utilizing the crawl space, by dumping them into the Des Plaines River. These missing individuals represented a haunting failure to achieve total closure for their families. The river search was vast and incredibly difficult. The Des Plaines River system is wide, heavily silted, and often experiences rapid currents, making recovery efforts nearly impossible. Yet within weeks of Gacy's confession, search teams did recover several human remains in and along the river. Forensic analysis confirmed that these were the bodies of 3 of the missing men: Samuel Stapleton, Randall Reffitt, and possibly one other. Despite the recovery of some of the river victims, the official tally of the unrecovered remained a painful footnote. The difficulty in locating and definitively identifying all the remains underscored the final layer of control Gacy exerted over his crimes. By choosing the difficult river for disposal, he ensured that some of his secrets would likely be lost to the currents forever. The focus then shifted entirely to Gacy's psychological makeup. Why the clown persona? Gacy's performances as Pogo the Clown were a crucial part of his public image and a cynical layer of misdirection. The clown, a symbol of joy and innocence, stood in stark contrast to the monster beneath. Experts theorized that the costume served as a form of psychological dissociation, allowing Gacy to separate the respected public figure from the sadistic, secretive killer. The clown persona was his ultimate disguise, shielding him from a world that preferred to believe its most decorated citizens could never be its most vile criminals. The trial, the defense, and the unidentified John Wayne Gacy's trial, which began in late 1979, was a media spectacle that riveted the nation. The prosecution, led by State's Attorney William Kunkel, had overwhelming physical evidence. 29 bodies recovered from Gacy's property, matching dental and bone records, and Gacy's own detailed confessions. The legal battle centered not on if Gacy committed the murders, but on his state of mind. Gacy's defense team pursued an aggressive but ultimately unsuccessful plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. They argued that Gacy suffered from a profound dissociative disorder, driven by a violent alter ego named Jack. The defense presented expert testimony claiming that Gacy was a victim of a severe mental illness, suggesting he was medically incapable of distinguishing right from wrong at the time of the killings. The prosecution countered this defense with powerful psychological evidence and Gacy's own meticulous planning. They demonstrated that Gacy's crimes were highly organized. He selected his victims carefully, used specific methods of disposal, and meticulously covered his tracks, including using lime and constructing covers for the crawl space ventilation. This level of planning, they argued, proved that Gacy understood the consequences of his actions and was motivated by a calculated, sadistic desire for control and dominance, not uncontrollable insanity. After a lengthy trial, the jury sided with the prosecution, rejecting the insanity defense. John Wayne Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder. In March 1980, he was sentenced to death. However, the case was never truly closed. The most enduring, painful legacy of the Gacy case is the mystery of the unidentified victims. Despite the tremendous forensic effort, 6 of the bodies recovered from Gacy's house and the river could not be definitively identified at the time of the trial. These 6 young men were buried under markers simply reading, "Unknown." Their families, wherever they might be, were never given closure. For decades, the identities of the unknowns haunted the case. Then in the 21st century, the power of DNA technology finally intervened. In 2011, using advanced mitochondrial DNA testing on the remains exhumed from the unknown plots, forensic experts were able to positively identify William Bundy, one of the long-forgotten victims. This breakthrough renewed hope for the remaining 5. Since then, persistent work by forensic geneticists and cold case investigators, often using genealogical DNA databases, has led to further identification. As of today, several more victims have been named, offering belated closure to families who had lived for over 40 years with the hope that their missing son was merely a runaway. John Wayne Gacy was executed in 1994, but the search for the names of his last victims continues. His story is a chilling testament to the duality of human nature, a reminder that the most terrifying criminals are often those who are best integrated into society, and that even decades later, the dead continue to speak through the quiet language of DNA. Gacy's methodology, the construction of a killer. The sheer volume of John Wayne Gacy's crimes required an understanding of his operational method, which was built upon his seemingly legitimate career as a construction contractor. Gacy was not a haphazard killer. He was a methodical planner who used his profession as his greatest tool for both luring victims and disposing of evidence. Gacy's contracting business, PDM Contractors, gave him a constant, credible reason to interact with vulnerable young men seeking manual labor. His truck filled with tools and materials allowed him to transport his victims and his victims' bodies without raising suspicion. His employees were often young men struggling financially, making them both susceptible to his false promises and less likely to be aggressively sought by authorities if they disappeared. The construction of the tomb beneath his house was equally methodical. Gacy was familiar with blueprints, drainage, and foundation work. He knew the limitations of his ranch home's crawl space. The shallow depth was a disadvantage, but the location was a massive advantage. The application of lime was a trick learned in construction to manage decay, though ineffective in the long run. He meticulously planned the placement of the bodies, attempting to pack them tightly and sequentially, maximizing the use of the limited space. This level of macabre structural planning cemented the prosecution's argument that he was fully aware and in control of his actions. Furthermore, Gacy utilized his construction projects for his psychological crimes. He would often commit his assaults and burglaries against other targets while on the road for work, using the cover of his contracting business to explain his movements across multiple jurisdictions. The police eventually linked Gacy to numerous unsolved break-ins where the perpetrator exhibited Gacy's signature behavior: meticulous organization of personal items and the taking of disturbing photographs of victims' personal space. This dual-life structure, the reliable contractor by day, the sadistic killer by night, was maintained with almost superhuman effort. He kept separate logs, separate aliases, Jack Hanley was one of many, and separate social circles. This capacity for maintaining two completely contradictory realities highlights the profound level of psychological dissociation required to sustain his criminal enterprise. Gacy did not just hide his victims beneath his house. He engineered his entire life to contain his darkest secret. The interrogation, the psychological trap of Detective Kozenczak. The eventual arrest and interrogation of John Wayne Gacy is considered a masterful piece of police work, primarily engineered by Detective Joseph Kozenczak. Kozenczak understood that confronting Gacy with minor evidence would fail. Gacy's narcissistic need for control was too powerful. The approach had to be entirely psychological. The initial hours of questioning were a battle of wills. Gacy, the seasoned community member and former precinct captain, acted the role of the falsely accused. He was polite, professional, and offered plausible explanations for every piece of circumstantial evidence, maintaining his absolute innocence. He was testing the police, expecting them to back down due to his high standing. Kozenczak never accused Gacy directly of murder. Instead, he employed a strategy of gradual escalation and subtle psychological manipulation. He repeatedly emphasized Gacy's reputation and standing, making it clear that Gacy had so much to lose by lying. The detective created a false environment of empathy, suggesting that Gacy might be suffering from a mental break or an uncontrollable impulse, thereby offering him an excuse that would protect his ego while guiding him toward a confession. The breakthrough moment, which we touched upon in the short script, was the use of the sealed envelope bluff. The detectives presented Gacy with a folder, claiming it contained a detailed map of the crime scenes that only the killer would know. They asked Gacy to review the document and mark which locations he remembered visiting, claiming this would help clarify his timeline. The truth was, the folder contained a blank map or list. By having Gacy voluntarily mark the locations where he picked up his victims and confirming his knowledge of the areas, Gacy authenticated the very crimes he was trying to deny. This psychological pressure, combined with the imminent discovery of the bodies beneath his house, which Gacy knew was happening, finally shattered his facade. The need to control the narrative, to confess on his own terms and ensure his story was heard, overrode his instinct to deny. Gacy began his chilling confession, detailing 33 separate murders and the horrifying locations of the bodies. The interrogation proved that Gacy's mind was not broken. It was calculating. and he was only defeated when the police utilized a trap designed specifically for his enormous ego. The Des Plaines River Mystery and the Final Unidentified. Even with John Wayne Gacy's detailed, if self-serving confession, the investigation was plagued by the enduring mystery of the victims whose remains were never recovered from the house. The 4 young men Gacy claimed he dumped into the Des Plaines River. Gacy confessed to throwing the bodies into the river from various bridges along the waterway in an attempt to dispose of them more quickly and cover his trail, fearing the limited space beneath his home would eventually expose him. This disposal method was strategically complex and posed an immediate massive challenge for law enforcement. The Des Plaines River is large and fast-flowing, and the chances of finding the remains intact were minimal. Search efforts were intense, involving dive teams, dragnets, and shoreline searches spanning miles of the riverbank. Within weeks, the teams recovered 3 sets of remains believed to be Gacy's victims. These were later identified through forensic efforts as 3 of the 4 missing men. However, the final crucial mystery remained: the identity of the 4th individual Gacy claimed to have thrown into the river. Despite Gacy's specific details and the exhaustive searches, this victim's remains were never definitively recovered or identified at the time. This meant that Gacy's final tally of victims included 1 young man whose physical body was swallowed by the current, leaving his family with no grave to visit and no closure. The case then focused heavily on the unidentified victims, the unknowns from the house. Even though 29 bodies were recovered from the crawl space, police were only able to identify 26 of them definitively using 1970s forensic science. 6 sets of remains remained stubbornly unidentified, buried in a local cemetery under simple stones marked with the date of discovery. This lack of identity created a unique moral imperative for later generations of law enforcement. The 6 unknowns symbolized the lasting harm of Gacy's methodical secrecy and the initial societal neglect that allowed him to prey on vulnerable individuals. The search for their names transcended the criminal investigation. It became a decades-long humanitarian effort to restore the dignity and identity Gacy had stolen from his final victims. The digital age breakthroughs, naming the unknowns. For over 3 decades, the 6 unknown victims of John Wayne Gacy represented a static, painful failure of 1970s forensic science. Their graves served as a constant, silent memorial to the victims the justice system could not identify. However, in the 21st century, technology provided a powerful new tool: forensic genetic genealogy. The breakthrough began in 2011 when the Cook County Sheriff's Department reopened the cold case file, focusing specifically on the 6 unidentified young men. They received special permission to exhume the 6 graves and extract fresh DNA samples from the remains, specifically focusing on mitochondrial DNA, which is more stable than nuclear DNA. The initial success was profound and immediate. By submitting the DNA profiles to the National CODIS database and utilizing new genealogical techniques, the team was able to match the remains of one victim to a living family member, William Bundy. Bundy had been missing since 1976, and his identification brought both closure and immense media attention to the cold case. The identification of William Bundy proved the viability of the project and established a critical precedent. Since 2011, investigators have continued the painstaking work, submitting the DNA profiles of the remaining unknowns to public genealogical databases, a technique that has revolutionized cold case investigations worldwide. By matching the victim's DNA to distant relatives who have uploaded their genetic information for ancestry purposes, investigators can build out family trees to pinpoint the identity of the remains. As of the current timeline, this methodology has successfully identified several more of Gacy's victims. The identification of James Hackinson, a young man who moved to Chicago from Minnesota, and Michael Marino, who was only 14 when he disappeared, offered poignant closure decades after their deaths. Each new name restored a stolen identity and allowed a family to finally bury their son knowing exactly who he was. The ongoing effort to identify the remaining victims is a powerful, modern counter-narrative to Gacy's attempt to erase them. Gacy's meticulous efforts to hide the bodies were ultimately defeated by the microscopic precision of modern science and the willingness of the victims' families and the public to participate in genetic research. The final hope remains that through continued work, Every single person buried beneath Gacy's suburban tomb will eventually have their name restored. The lasting legacy. Why the phantom persists. John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994, bringing a formal end to his physical presence, but not to the terror he instilled. His death marked the closing of a painful chapter, but the case's legacy extends far beyond his execution. Gacy's case permanently changed American law enforcement and forensic science. It forced the FBI and local police departments to radically rethink the categorization of missing persons, especially vulnerable populations, and led to the eventual establishment of centralized systems to cross-reference disappearances across jurisdictions. Furthermore, the Gacy investigation's monumental challenges directly spurred advancements in forensic identification techniques, paving the way for the DNA breakthroughs that are now identifying his final victims. The story of Gacy is a chilling narrative about the banality of evil. He was not a monster lurking in an abandoned building. He was the smiling, well-dressed, politically connected neighbor. His ability to perform the role of a respected citizen while simultaneously committing atrocities served as a permanent warning against superficial trust and the dangers of psychological duality. The image of Pogo the clown, once a symbol of childhood joy, became forever synonymous with deep-seated hidden malice. Even after his execution, Gacy continued to manipulate the narrative. He spent his final years creating disturbing clown paintings and cryptic artworks from prison, often signing them with macabre references to his crimes. These paintings became twisted commodities, selling for high prices, showing the cultural, morbid fascination with his pathology. The Gacy home on Summerdale Avenue was demolished soon after the bodies were recovered. The entire property was excavated, the materials hauled away, and the foundation filled. A new home was eventually built on the site, but the psychological scar on the neighborhood and the nation remains. The land itself is a silent, harrowing memorial to the 29 young men buried there. The persistent work to name the remaining unidentified victims, the last pieces of Gacy's dark puzzle, underscores the commitment to dignity. The final triumph over John Wayne Gacy is not that he was caught and punished, but that his final calculated act of erasure has been steadily reversed by science and dedication. The phantom in the tunnels has been defeated not by force, but by the unwavering demand that every stolen life be remembered by its true name.